Hello everybody, Rosemary's asked me to make some simple bread, so I'm going to show you all how to do this while you are locked up in captivity at home. First thing you need is 500 grams of flour. Because our cupboard's a bit depleted, I'm using a mixture of flours. This first white one here is actually an Italian bread flour. It's called 00 and it's very fine. It's ground up on very small grinders, so I'm using about half that. The advantage of this, if you're doing it with anything, is that it works very quickly with yeast because it's so powdery. I'm also going to add strong malted grain flour. It's best if you can use something like a 00 flour or a strong flour, because if you use ordinary flours that you would use for cooking, they're soft and they tend to break down and they make sort of cakey bread, which I don't think is what you're really after. You really need the gluten in the strong flour to hold the bread itself together and to hold the bubbles of air so that the bread rises and you get a really nice crust and crumb. Just to this flour, I'm going to add 1.5 teaspoons of salt. I tend to measure it out using a teaspoon measurer rather than by weight, but I think we're looking for about 10 or 11 grams of salt to the flour. And then about the same of the yeast. I'm going to use 2 teaspoons here, which is somewhere around about 10 to 12 grams of yeast. I'm using the ready mix easy bake yeast. You just simply add it in and let it get wet, and slowly it will start to work. So I've got a mixture of dry ingredients here. I'm just going to give them a quick stir. I tend to use a fork until the point of starting to knead it. But in fact, most bread, I think, benefits from a little phase where you add the liquid to it and you just leave it covered for about half an hour and let the water soak into the flour in much the same way, I think, as when you make Yorkshire pudding. You probably mix everything with the flour and you leave the flour to swell. And after that point, I'll come back and I'll knead it again. For the liquid today, just because I like the flavour in my bread, I've used half Budweiser beer, which I've topped up from the kettle, and then a little cold water to make sure that it's only just at blood temperature. So when I put my finger in, it feels neither hot nor cold. It's the same temperature as I am. And I've got about 400 millilitres of this liquid, which is about half beer. And I'm going to use it gradually because according to the type of flour you've got, different flours drink different amounts of water. So if you're using a brown flour, it'll take a lot of water. If you're using a white flour, particularly a powdery 00, it probably doesn't need quite as much. So I don't really know at this stage, so I'm going to be cautious. I'm going to pour in about 300 millilitres and give it a good stir until it starts to come together in a rough dough. You can be quite vigorous with it, not as vigorous as I've been to get it out of the edge of the bowl, but you really do need to get the water stirred right through it. And as you can see, it's in shreds at this moment, so it needs a bit more liquid. I'm not going to add all of it. I'm again going to just cautiously pour in half of what's left. There we are, and work it quite hard until I can see it starting to come together. Jamie Oliver says it comes away from the edge of the bowl. Mine never looks as good as his, I have to say, but it probably tastes better. That's what I say. So working it quite hard to make sure that the flour is all damp and stirred in. You can see there's just a little bit left at the bottom there. I'm just going to turn it over because the top is wet and sticky. So just rolling it around like that to make sure that every bit of the flour is used up. And now I'm going to just leave it. I'm just going to have a little feel. I think that could do with a little bit more liquid. The shredding, when it looks shreddy like this and it hasn't quite come together. In fact, it's interesting, even as I'm pouring the liquid over, I can see it soaking straight in. So we're going again with the fork, mashing it through. Yep, that feels quite a good consistency. Can you see that it's all come away from the edge of the bowl, and although it is quite liquid, a lot of that will be absorbed by the flour in the next half hour. So I'll see you in half an hour. Hello again. You'll see that I've got the bread here, the dough. It's been covered all this time because it's really important to keep the dough covered so that the moisture doesn't escape before the moment of cooking. So it's been sitting for about half an hour, and it's quite a good sticky dough. Sticky is fine. It's a bit annoying if you're not used to it on your hands, but it's better to have a softer dough. I think it's better to work with. Now what I'm going to do is add a little bit of olive oil onto my hands to stop it sticking too much, and I'm also going to add a little bit of olive oil into the bread dough, which I'm going to knead in as we go. It helps it to just be a little bit stretchier, and again I think it adds a little bit to the flavour itself. I'm going to put some flour down on the surface, not too much, because again while I'm kneading it I'm not really trying to introduce more and more flour and make the dough drier and drier. What I'm trying to do is just stop it sticking to the surface. So I'm just going to give it a little roll round and then knead it. Now, kneading is something that I think you need to do for probably about, roughly speaking, 8 or 10 minutes. Just again, a little flour just to stop it sticking to the surface. And while you're doing this, you can feel that the dough itself stops being quite so sticky and it starts to feel pillowy. I learnt to knead my bread like this, rolling it in and pushing it down and squeezing it, but there are plenty of ways of doing it, and the other kind of well-known way of doing it is to stretch it like that and then pull it back and turn it, stretch it out, pull it back and turn it. Both of these do the same thing, which is to bring the gluten out in the bread itself and make sure that the bread has that elastic quality that again catches the air and makes the bread nice and soft. Now I'm not going to make you watch me for 10 minutes while I chatter inanely and stretch my bread, so I'll see you again in a few minutes. Okay. So you can see that what I'm doing here is finally just pushing it around. If you see the tabletop, there's no flour underneath. I'm keeping it moving, it's not sticky, it's got quite a nice consistency. And now I'm going to let it sit and do its first main rise. I'm going to just put a little bit more olive oil into the bowl and just rub it around with my hands to stop the ball of dough sticking to it. I'm going to sit my dough in, and I'm going to put a little olive oil on the top, again just to stop the plastic sticking to it. You can use cling film, or you can use a tea towel that's been run under water and squeezed out and put over the top, because you're trying to keep the moisture in and stop the bread dough itself drying out and changing the consistency of the surface. So put it in, cover it up well, and I'm going to leave it in a warm place, and I'm going to go out for a cycle ride, and I'll be back in about an hour and a half. Hello again everyone. This has been out sitting for about an hour and 3/4. It's a lovely warm day, and I think you can see that this is puffed up beautifully. It's very soft, and it's full of air. We're going to knock this air back. I'm going to actually just take it straight out of the bowl and just give it a sort of quick knead to make it into the shape I want. Now at this point you've got a lot of choices. You can cut it into two and make two nice little loaves, which we would normally do and put one in the freezer, but today I'm going to make it in one piece, and then I'm going to cut it in half, put half in the freezer, and then we use a sort of half moon half and just cut it into bigger and smaller slices as we go. This is back to about the same size that it was, but it feels completely different. It's very pillowy, it's very soft, it's actually slightly warm. It depends on the temperature of your room, how quickly it'll rise, but it also depends on the flour that you've used. So if you use brown flour, it tends to take a little longer. The bread can be a bit heavier. You can do the same rise in a bowl and knock it back several times. The more times you knock it back, probably the lighter the bread becomes in one way, but also the more yeasty flavour you get. And I quite like that, so I might sometimes just knock it back another time. It's only bread dough. If I really don't have time to cook it, I might do that anyway, put it in the fridge, take it out later, let it re-rise. So at this point you have a bread dough that could be used for several things. You could make pizza. You could make what my grandmother called pizza fritte, which is little pieces of dough flattened out and fried in oil, which puffs up absolutely beautifully, is really crisp, absolutely delicious, and goes really well with cheese or with dips or anything like that. Really nice to have with drinks as well. So you've got a really versatile little product here, but what I'm going to do is bake it as a loaf of bread. So I need it to grow back into a reasonably good sized shape, ready to go into the oven. So I'm going to just use a baking tray, nothing fancy about that. As ever, and because I'm Italian, I'm going to cover it in oil, so a little swipe of oil there, and I'm just going to rub it round like that so that the bread won't stick. Now I'm going to lift up my bread dough, as you can see, still not sticky, and I'm just going to place it on here. One of the things I'm doing here is trying to just shape it in such a way by sort of folding under that I give it a little bit of height, because that will actually help it in its final shape, and it will also help it to stay plumpy. Sometimes when you put a bread dough like this down, it does spread out and you end up with something quite thin, particularly if you're using sourdough. That doesn't really bother me, but if it bothers you, you can use a tin instead, which will give you the shape that you can cut and put into a toaster. We're just going to leave this. I'm going to cover it. I'm going to get a little piece of cling film and cover it over, and when we come back in about 3/4 of an hour to an hour, you'll see that it's risen up really beautifully. I've also put the oven on already, onto 220. Ideally, if your oven needs to be pretty hot when you put the dough into it, so it's good to bring it up to temperature in advance and let it run. See you in a bit. Hello again. So this only took about half an hour. It's a lovely warm day, and the bread, as you can see, it's spread out a little bit, but also it has risen quite well. I'm just going to give it a little bit more shape, and I'm going to, and you can see the bubbles popping up out of it as we go. You see, that looks quite appealing, really. I'm going to actually slash the bread. I'm just going to use a sharp knife, and I'm going to just give it basically a smile across the bread, and that should give us a little lifted crust. I'm going to just pop it straight into the oven now, where it will cook for about 35 minutes on 200 fan, and then I'm going to come back and check it. It will need turning over at that point, and we'll see about the other side. Various different ways to tell if your bread is done, but you tap it until you can hear that it's hollow, and some people, like Paul Hollywood, like their bread really dark. I prefer it to be golden. So we'll have a look together in about 35 minutes. Hello folks, the bleak's just gone, so we're going to have a look at the bread. It's had 35 minutes on a 200 fan oven. If you haven't got a fan oven, then it's probably better to give it to have it on 220 so that you get a good rise out of it. As you can see, it's quite a nice golden colour, and I've turned it over, and I'm just going to give it a tap on the bottom to see if it's done. There's quite a good sound, but it's not quite hollow enough, so I'm going to just turn it back up the other way and pop it back into the oven for 5 minutes, just on the same temperature on 200. Last 5 minutes in the oven. Let's just take him out. A nice big loaf here with a fairly good amount of height, and hopefully nice and hollow sounding, so done all the way through. I'm going to cool that before I cut into it. If this goes well, I'm quite happy to show you how I could shape the dough to make the loaf a little bit thicker, a little bit taller, but for a straightforward home loaf, this is probably quite good enough. See you later. Here we are with the loaf all cooled down. Let's have a look at what it looks like inside. Nice crusty edge and a nice frothy crumb. Good. Enjoy it. If you want any further tips, I've got a few.